Today we're going to look at the principles of training and we're going to link it back to an exam question. So, the principles of training, these are the principles that you should include in a training program and is going to be effective. So the first one, specificity. The program needs to be specific to the needs of the athlete. So that could involve fitness components, energy systems, muscles and skills. For example, a sprinter would need to be focusing on speed, whereas an endurance athlete would need to focus on cardiovascular fitness. An endurance athlete would focus on aerobic fitness, a sprinter on anaerobic fitness, and so on. Progression then, so over time as the body adapts, we're going to need to increase the frequency of training, so how often we train within a week. The intensity of training, so for example with your endurance athlete, maybe training for a 10k race. In the first few weeks of training they may be running 9-minute miles. As those weeks go on, bit by bit, gradually we're going to run at a faster pace. So maybe after 2 weeks, 9-minute miles become miles that we want to run in 8 minutes 45. And we're going to do it gradually so we avoid so that we're avoiding injury and that we're avoiding demotivation. Duration of the sessions may go up then as well, so longer sessions. Overload then is linked to progression. It's often known as one concept, progressive overload, but essentially overload is how you achieve progression. If you don't overload, you will not achieve progression. So that's to do with the concept we call FID, frequency, intensity and duration. So frequency, how often you train. You've got to train often enough to overload the body. For example, we had the 560 programme in Wales in secondary schools, and that comes from the recommendation that young people should be exercising 5 times per week for 60 minutes. However, that's going to depend on the sport and the seasons. So, for example, a footballer in pre-season may be training 4 or 5 times a week or 4 or 5 days a week. When the season kicks off and there are more games, that training volume and that training frequency comes down so that we're avoiding injury and we understand the importance of rest. Intensity then, if we want to overload the aerobic system, we're going to work between 60 and 80% of our maximal heart rate and the anaerobic 80% plus. Duration, well again that's got to be sport specific, so I'll go back to the 560 programme that was introduced in Wales. The recommendation was that young people exercised for health benefits 5 times per week for 60 minutes. Now that's going to depend on your sport. So your sprint sessions, if you're a sprinter, 100 metre sprinter, your sessions are probably going to be a lot shorter than, for example, an endurance athlete, because you're going to be looking at developing the ATP-PC system, explosive power and speed, whereas the endurance athlete is going to need to train in that aerobic zone for a number of hours. So again, duration to overload is going to be different in different sports. It's going to be sport specific. Variance then is about avoiding boredom and maintaining motivation. So if we go back to an endurance runner who's been running a lot on the flat or on the track, they may do some hill work. The benefit of that, maybe by running on hills or even running on sand, on beaches, is that it makes it a little bit more exciting, keeps the interest, keeps the motivation, but also it's going to challenge the body as well, because when you're running uphill or downhill, you may well challenge slightly different muscles than you would if you were just running on the flat. So there's merit to variance. Right, the question is one that came up in a paper, and a lot of pupils ended up in the bottom band for this question. And I don't think it was the fact that it was on principles of training, because that's something we cover quite a few times. I think it's more to do with the way the question is written. And I've looked at it, I'm quite experienced in the GCSE course, and it took me about 20 minutes to get my head around exactly what the examiner was asking for, so not an easy question. Here is the question. Using the principles of training, evaluate how a rugby player could improve performance. So these are the 3 things that I thought about when I looked at the marking scheme of the question. It's very clear that they want appropriate examples, and they want those examples to come from rugby, which is why they've mentioned it in the question. It was actually specifically a rugby player, Jonathan Davis, that they were asking for, but I've made it more general. So that's the first thing. Examples are going to be important, particularly rugby-related examples. 2 then, explicit links between principles and improved performance. So you've got to link these principles that I've just talked about, SPOV, to the improvement of performance. Describing what they are isn't going to be enough. You've got to link them to performance and how they may improve performance. The third thing then is the word evaluation. Okay, so we need to make a reasoned judgment. So I'll explain through example maybe how I do that. I've written down a little opening paragraph, and then I've written down my second paragraph. The way you structure it is you want to have as an extended writing question, an intro, a discussion in the middle where you're going to be evaluative, and then obviously a conclusion where you're hopefully going to back up to the examiner that you've made a reasoned judgment on the principles of training and how they could improve performance in rugby. But you've got a natural structure because you've got your introduction and then a paragraph on specificity, progression, overload, variance, and then your conclusion. So I'd expect you to be writing SPOV and FID along the side of the exam paper to give you that structure. So I'll just give you my first 2 paragraphs. So the first one, short and snappy. A rugby player should use the principles of training if he or she wishes to improve performance, full stop. Second paragraph then on specificity. And in this paragraph, this is what I really honed in on. Making sure that I used examples, rugby examples, making sure that I linked the principles to improve performance, and making sure that I made a reasoned judgment. So I was showing the examiner that I have evaluation skills. Okay, a rugby player can improve performance by being specific, full stop. If the player trains components such as power, he or she will be more effective when tackling and rucking, making them a more effective player. Okay, I'm going to be a bit more evaluative now though. If the player was not specific and trained components and skills not relevant to his position in sport, they would not improve performance. So that's where I feel I'm being evaluative and I'm making a reasoned judgment. I've linked the principles to performance quite clearly. I've made sure that I use examples, which is where I talked about developing power to make you better at tackling and better at rucking. The reasoned judgment then comes in where one sentence will say, by using the principles of training, you will improve performance because you'll be better at rucking, better at tackling. The last sentence I make then is the other way around where it says, if you're not specific, you will not improve performance. So, like I said, I really had to think about how you would answer that question. And my challenge to you now is, can you answer that question in full? And in the other paragraphs that you write on progression, overload and variance, can you ensure that you've got appropriate examples, that the principle is really linked to performance and that is obvious to the examiner, and that you're using reasoned judgments? So you're going to say, if they do this and they do overload, performance will improve. If they do this and they do not overload, performance will not improve. And I feel then you will have been evaluative and you will have made sure that you've got reasoned judgment. So that's the video. A little bit heavy, tough question, but I think it's important that we address these tricky questions because these are the ones where people tend to be at the lower end of the spectrum with the level of marks that they get. Okay, thank you.